I'm Nora Bennett, 31 years old, standing in a white dress while my phone lights up with a final message. If your sister isn't invited, we're not coming. The venue by Lake Erie is set chairs in neat rows, flowers breathing in the morning breeze. And yet that one sentence sits colder than the water. Jacob's ring is in my palm, warm from his hand, but my parents' ultimatum pushes every old bruise to the surface. Tyler says he'll be there no matter what. Sabrina says she'll show up whether she's welcome or not. I tell myself a wedding is a beginning, but the past refuses to wait its turn. Before we go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and if you've ever had to choose peace over approval, hit that like and subscribe, so this story finds the people who need it. I grew up on a quiet street outside Cleveland, the kind with maple trees that drop leaves like confetti every October, and neighbors who wave from driveways. Our house held the sort of rules that sound noble on paper. Be kind work, hard family first, but somewhere along the way, kindness meant silence. Work meant caring more than your share, and family first meant one person at the center and everyone else circling. My mother Diane could soften any hard moment with a casserole and a whispered, "Don't make trouble," and my father Frank loved order pictures in straight lines and stories that made our family look polished. I learned early to read a room, lower my voice, and keep my hands busy. There is a skill to quiet, though it can cost you. Sabrina, 2 years ahead of me, was the kind of child people notice without trying. She moved through crowds like she belonged to them, and people believed it because confidence is a bright thing. Tyler came along after me with a gentler spirit and a wide, watchful smile. In those days, my place in the house felt like a hallway between rooms useful for getting somewhere else. I wasn't unhappy all the time. There were library afternoons and sketchbooks filled with pencil shadings and the small satisfaction of stacking dishes just right. But there was a hum underneath the sense that some lives matter more in the same four walls. My grandfather Walter was the one who gave me words I could hold. He smelled like Old Spice and winter wool, and he took me to yard sales where a quarter could buy a book that would last me a week. Pay attention, he'd say. Not unkindly, the world will tell you what it is if you listen. He never asked me to be smaller, so someone else could be bigger. With him, I learned the slow grace of careful seeing how to make space around a feeling until it has a shape you can name. When I was old enough to take the bus to the city library, I found a second kind of home. The cool air, the orderly shelves, the soft sound of pages made sense to me. Later, I shelved books there for pay, and the first time someone trusted me with a key, I carried it like a medal. School came easily because reading did and writing did and listening did, and a teacher once pressed a note into my palm that said, "Use your voice." I kept that note in a drawer, folded and refolded the paper thin as onion skin by the time I left for college. College was a different country, same state, new air. Professors asked for my thoughts and waited for the answer. The campus job in the stacks paid by the hour, and I learned how long good work takes, how it feels to clock out, knowing you earned what you're holding. The friends I made liked quiet movies and late talk, and they didn't mind if I thought before I spoke. It wasn't shiny, but it was steady, and steady suits a person who has lived years trying not to make a ripple. I met Jacob in a seminar he came back to support after he'd already graduated. He answered questions like each one mattered and looked people in the eye, even the nervous ones. He asked about the essay I mentioned, then read it, then asked better questions. He did not turn my past into a punchline or tell me I was sensitive when I told him the things I had learned to say softly. He framed the first story I ever published in a student journal and hung it above his desk like it belonged there. When we settled in Pittsburgh, I kept working with words first at a library, then editing copy for people who ran more on speed than sense. The city felt wider than my childhood, with bridges folding the river open and row houses stacked like book spines. We bought a small table second-hand and ate at it every night, not because we had to, but because we wanted to sit across from each other and say what the day had been. On weekends, we walked coffee in hand, counting steps more by conversation than any number. Planning a wedding seemed easy at first. Simple vows by the water, a short list of people who meant us well, a dress that moved when the wind did. We chose Lake Erie because it is familiar and honest, not grand, but constant. My grandfather said he would wear his good suit and stand as tall as his back allowed. Tyler offered to help with anything, which meant everything, because he keeps his word like it's a living thing. For a while, it all felt clear. Then the question, the one I knew was coming, arrived with my mother's voice, "Will your sister be invited?" The room went still. The lake in my mind flattened. It is a simple sentence to anyone who hasn't lived with the weight behind it. I heard myself breathe and knew the answer before I spoke it, but knowing and saying are not the same. The reply I gave changed the air in the house, and the air hasn't been the same since. On the morning my parents sent their final message, "Come with your sister or don't expect us," the florists were tying the last ribbon, and Tyler was checking the sound system with Jacob's best friend. I stood behind the tent phone in my hand and felt the old ache and the new calm meet in the middle. The chairs faced the water like people listening. Somewhere out on the lake, a boat moved slow and sure. I put the phone face down on the table and told myself to walk out when it was time. But a memory rose uninvited of the first time a celebration in our house turned into something I wasn't allowed to hold. And that is where the real story of this began. I was 10 the first time I realized how quickly joy could turn to shame. It was my birthday, the kitchen filled with laughter and the sweet smell of chocolate frosting. I leaned forward to blow out the candles, my friends crowding close. But before I could take a breath, Sabrina let the cake slip from her hands. It hit the floor with a soft, sickening thud. Frosting splattered across the tile and up my shoes. Everyone froze, then burst out laughing, following Sabrina's lead. My cheeks burned my throat tight, and I wanted to cry, but my parents waved it off like it was nothing. "She's just teasing," my mother said, already reaching for a towel. My father added, "Don't make such a fuss." That was the first time I learned what that phrase really meant in our house. Don't make it harder for us to keep pretending everything's fine. I helped scrape frosting off the floor, while Sabrina grinned, basking in the attention. After the guests left, I sat alone at the table looking at the cracked remains of my birthday candles, wondering if I'd imagined how cruel it felt. A few years later, she found my diary, the one with the tiny lock I thought kept my secret safe. I came home from school to find her in the living room, reading it aloud to her friends, each page greeted with another round of laughter. I froze at the doorway, too stunned to move. My mother appeared, looked at the scene, and sighed. "Girls enough," she said gently, not to stop Sabrina, but to keep peace in the room. When I cried and begged her to intervene, she brushed my hair back and whispered, "Don't be so sensitive, Nora. Your sister's just having fun." It wasn't fun for me. It was humiliation. But in our family, there were no apologies for that. Sabrina was allowed to shine, and I was expected to stand quietly in the glow no matter how it burned. By the time we reached middle school, her face was everywhere in the house. Framed photos from dance recitals, cheer performances, school events. My own certificates, a few spelling bees, and art ribbons sat tucked in drawers. When I once asked if we could frame one, my father smiled faintly and said, "We can't hang everything, honey." I told myself it didn't matter, but it did. The walls told a story, and I wasn't in it. The clearest memory from those years was the art contest. I was 10 again, the theme, My Dream Home. I spent the entire week coloring a picture of a small yellow house with a white fence and a sunroom filled with flowers. My art teacher said it had heart, and when I won first place, I couldn't wait to show my parents. I ran home with the certificate in my hand, my chest buzzing with pride. But when I opened the front door, my mother and father were already celebrating. Sabrina had just been chosen as a cheerleader for her school team. They were cheering, planning her new uniform, calling relatives. I stood there with my certificate until my arm ached. When my mother finally noticed, she gave it a quick glance and said, "That's nice, sweetheart," before turning back to Sabrina. I remember sliding the certificate into my dresser that night, the paper still warm from my hands. I stared at it until the words blurred, realizing that no matter what I did, I would never win their attention the way she could with a single smile. That was the night something inside me changed, not loud, not angry, just a quiet acceptance that I was invisible in my own home. As we got older, the distance between us grew wider. Sabrina became popular, the kind of girl everyone noticed when she walked into a room. She joined the cheer squad, dated one of the school's basketball stars, and had her photo in the yearbook 3 times that year. My parents couldn't stop talking about her. They hung her pictures on the mantel and retold her stories at every dinner as if she were their proudest accomplishment. I learned to eat quietly, nod when spoken to, and pretend it didn't sting. I found comfort where I could in books and sketching and after-school debate club. The library became a refuge, the only place where silence didn't feel like punishment. I joined the debate team and discovered I liked it, the structure, the order, the chance to speak without being interrupted. My coach once told me, "You've got a calm kind of confidence, Nora. People listen when you speak." No one at home ever said that to me. One Friday, I came home carrying a certificate from a regional debate meet. My parents were in the kitchen with Sabrina helping her plan a costume for the spring dance. I waited for a lull in the conversation before showing them the paper. My mother smiled politely. "That's great, dear," she said, then turned back to discuss fabric colors. My father nodded. "Good job." And that was it. I folded the certificate and put it away. The unfairness became impossible to ignore when I was 15. Sabrina learned I liked a boy named Eric from my friend group, a quiet, kind boy who shared his notes with me in math class. She told everyone I had confessed to him and been rejected, though I hadn't said a word. The story spread through school like wildfire. When I confronted her, she laughed and said, "Relax, it's just a joke. Don't take it so seriously." The next morning I went to my parents thinking surely they'd see this was wrong. But my mother sighed. "Your sister didn't mean any harm." My father's tone was sharper. "We're tired of your drama, Nora. Stop turning every little thing into a crisis." That was the moment I stopped expecting fairness. I stopped expecting rescue. After that, I kept my feelings to myself. I stayed late at school, spent weekends at the library, and learned to live quietly within my own small world. Sabrina's laughter filled the house every evening, drifting up from the living room, and I'd lie in bed imagining a life where no one used kindness as an excuse for cruelty. My brother Tyler started noticing things around then. He was only 12, but he saw enough to whisper once, "You're not wrong, Nora." They always side with her. It was the first time someone in our family said it out loud. I remember that sentence better than most birthdays. When high school ended, Sabrina's popularity carried her farther than her grades ever could. She applied to a handful of colleges, but none accepted her. My parents called it bad luck. They said she was meant for something else, something bigger. I didn't argue. By then I had learned that reason had no place in conversations about Sabrina. When my own acceptance letter came from Ohio State, it felt like sunlight after years of shade. I held it like it might disappear, reading it over and over until I could say the words without shaking. But when I told my parents, their smiles were short-lived. My father frowned, saying, "That's too far from home. You'll make your sister feel left behind." My mother nodded, adding softly, "Family should stay together." I tried to explain how hard I had worked, how much I wanted this chance, but they only grew defensive. My father's voice rose. "You're always thinking about yourself. Why can't you think of others for once?" The word others landed heavy, as if I had never been one of them. That night, Tyler came to my room. He was sitting on the edge of my bed, hands clasped tight, when he said, "One day I'm leaving too. I don't want to live in a house that pretends black is white." I didn't answer, but the sound of his voice stayed with me long after he left the room. When I finally packed for college, I did it quietly, folding clothes into boxes while the rest of the house slept. My father barely looked up when I said goodbye. My mother hugged me, whispering, "Don't be angry at us. You'll understand someday." I nodded, though I knew I wouldn't. The bus ride to Columbus felt endless, but for the first time the silence didn't hurt. I looked out the window at the flat fields rolling by and thought about everything I was leaving behind, not just the house, but the version of myself that had spent years waiting to be seen. That was the day I promised I would never again let someone else decide how bright I could shine. And yet, even freedom carries its ghosts, because some wounds, especially the ones shaped like family, don't fade the moment you step outside their walls. They follow quietly, waiting for the day you dare to live without them. Life at Ohio State was the first time I could breathe without waiting for someone to tell me I was taking up too much air. The campus felt like another world, tall brick buildings wrapped in ivy, wide lawns dotted with students reading under trees, and a library that smelled like fresh paper and hope. My dorm room was small, but it was mine, I hung my sketches on the wall, played quiet music when I studied, and for the first time in my life, no one barged in to laugh at what I loved. At first I worried I wouldn't fit in. Years of being the quiet one had trained me to stay invisible. But college had its own rhythm, and I found my place in it slowly. I got a part-time job at the university library shelving books and manning the circulation desk. The work was simple, but I loved it. The calm order of it, the way students thanked me when I helped them find what they needed. My supervisor, Mrs. Cooper, once said, "You're one of the most reliable people here, Nora. You make things better without anyone asking." It was a small thing, but it meant more than she probably realized. Classes were harder than I expected, but I loved every moment of them. Literature, composition, history, they gave me a voice I didn't know I had. In one class, a professor asked us to write a personal essay, and I turned in something I never thought I'd share a story about growing up in the shadow of someone who took up all the light. When she returned the paper, she'd written in red ink at the bottom, "Your quiet strength carries more power than noise ever could." I carried that paper in my notebook for years. I joined the campus writing club after a girl named Elise invited me. She sat beside me one afternoon in the student lounge, noticed the notebook on my lap, and said, "You look like someone with stories to tell." At first, I only listened during meetings, too shy to read anything aloud. But after a few weeks, I volunteered to share a short story about two sisters, one adored, one overlooked. When I finished, the room was still for a moment, then filled with gentle applause. A boy near the window smiled and said, "That felt real." For the first time, my pain didn't sound like whining. It sounded like art. The farther I grew from home, the clearer things became. I called my parents once a week out of habit more than warmth. They always asked if I was eating well, if I had made friends, but within minutes the conversation drifted back to Sabrina. "She's figuring out what she wants to do," my mother would say. "We're so proud of how hard she's trying." My father would add, "She's just looking for the right path." I'd listen quietly, nodding, even though they couldn't see me, and tell them I was doing fine when they finally asked. They never asked what fine meant. When I came home for Thanksgiving that first year, nothing had changed. Sabrina had dropped out of her classes at the community college and was spending most days working part-time at a salon. My parents praised her for getting experience. During dinner, the talk circled around her plans, maybe beauty school, maybe retail management, and every sentence carried the same refrain: "She just needs a little more time." I mentioned that one of my short stories had been published in the campus magazine, hoping it might spark a smile, but my father only said, "That's nice, but you can't live off writing." Sabrina winked at me across the table, smirking as if she'd won something I didn't even know we were competing for. By my sophomore year, I stopped going home unless I had to. Holidays became quieter in the dorm, or spent with friends who invited me to their houses, places where laughter wasn't a performance. I still sent small gifts to my parents, a framed photo, a bookstore card, but the thank yous were always brief and polite. "Your sister loved the scarf you sent," my mother once texted. There was no mention of whether she liked her own. It didn't surprise me. Then one autumn afternoon I met Jacob Reed. It happened by accident at a technology seminar my friend Elise convinced me to attend. He was standing near the front answering students' questions with an easy confidence that didn't feel rehearsed. He had a calm voice and the kind of smile that makes you believe he's actually listening. Afterward, I thanked him for his talk, expecting the usual polite nod, but instead he asked what I studied. When I said English, he laughed softly. "You work with words. I work with numbers. Maybe we balance each other out." We started meeting for coffee then, for walks across campus. He asked about my writing, not just the words, but the meaning behind them. When I told him how I'd grown up feeling like background noise, he didn't offer advice or pity. He just said, "That must have been lonely." It was such a simple acknowledgement, yet it landed like warmth after years of cold. He came to one of the writing club readings one evening. I didn't expect him to, but he sat quietly in the back until I finished. When I walked off stage, he handed me a folded program with a note scribbled in the margin. "You don't just write, you make people see." That note stayed in my wallet for years. Months passed easily after that. We studied in quiet corners of the library, cooked small dinners in the student apartments, and shared long drives without music. He asked about my family once, and I told him enough to understand the distance. "You don't owe anyone permission to be happy," he said. I didn't realize how much I needed to hear it until then. When I graduated, he was already working in Pittsburgh as a software engineer. We found a small apartment near the river, nothing fancy but bright and warm. We furnished it slowly, one weekend trip at a time. I got a job as a copy editor for a local publishing firm, and every evening we'd meet in the kitchen to trade stories about our day. For the first time, home felt like a place built on laughter that didn't hurt. My parents came to visit once that first year. They stayed for 2 hours, polite but restless. My mother commented that the apartment was small. My father asked when we planned to buy a house. Sabrina had just started another new job, and most of the visit was spent talking about her. "She's really growing up," my mother said proudly. Jacob listened politely, but later, after they left, he turned to me and asked, "Do they ever ask how you're doing?" I smiled thinly and said, "They think they know." A year later, Jacob proposed. It happened on a cool October afternoon in a park lined with orange leaves. He knelt on one knee beside a wooden bench where we always sat and said simply, "Let's build something real." I said yes before he finished the sentence. We decided on a small ceremony by Lake Erie, simple and close to home. It felt right until the wedding plans began. The first storm came when I called my mother to finalize the guest list. She asked, "You're inviting your sister, aren't you?" The question carried weight even before the argument followed. When I hesitated, she gasped, "Nora, she's family." I tried to explain gently, but she cut me off. "If you don't invite her, we won't come." My father's voice came through the speaker next, steady but cold. "Family must be whole. Don't cause division." That night I sat at the kitchen table staring at the phone. Jacob reached across the table and took my hand. "We can have the wedding we want," he said. "The people who love you will show up." I nodded, though my chest felt heavy. I had built a life where peace finally felt possible, yet the past had found its way back, demanding to be let in again. A week later, Tyler called. He had heard about the fight. "You're doing the right thing," he said quietly. "They've never seen how much it hurt you, but I have." His voice steadied me. It reminded me that truth doesn't need to shout to stand firm. I looked around our little home, the bookshelves, the framed photo of my grandfather smiling at the camera, the window that caught the evening sun, and I knew what kind of life I wanted. Calm, honest, free. But calm doesn't last when the people who raised you believe chaos is love, and soon I would learn just how far they were willing to go to keep their illusion of family intact. The message from my parents came late one night, hours after Jacob had fallen asleep beside me. The screen lit up again and again with the same words in different forms, calls, texts, even an email, each saying the same thing. "If your sister isn't invited, we're not coming." I sat in the dark phone, glowing against the quiet room, my heart beating slow and heavy. It wasn't a surprise, but seeing the words written out like a verdict still hit hard. For a long moment, I didn't move. Then I turned off the phone and laid it face down on the table. Over the next few days, the silence between us turned into something heavier. My mother's voice filled every voicemail with the same appeal. "Family is everything, Nora. Don't ruin this day over pride." My father's messages were sharper, colder. "You're making a mistake. You'll regret it." I didn't respond to any of them. When I tried to work, my mind drifted. Even the simplest edits blurred together until Jacob leaned over one evening and said softly, "You've been staring at the same line for 10 minutes. We sat at the kitchen table, the smell of his coffee filling the air. I told him about the messages, every word I could remember. He listened quietly, his fingers tracing slow circles against the mug. "You're not wrong," he said when I finished. "You're protecting your peace if they can't see that it's not on you." The calm in his voice grounded me in a way my parents never had. For the first time in weeks, I exhaled without shaking. Tyler called that weekend. He already knew. "Mom's been talking to everyone in the family," he said. "She's trying to make you sound heartless." His tone was steady, not angry, just tired. "You're doing the right thing. I'll be there no matter what." Hearing those words from him steadied something inside me. We had both grown up watching the same storm. Now we were finally standing outside of it. But the quiet didn't last. The following week, I came home from work to find an envelope taped to the front door. Inside was a handwritten letter in my mother's careful cursive, the ink pressed deep into the paper. "We raised you better than this. You're destroying the family name. Your sister is devastated." At the bottom, my father's signature stretched like a line drawn in sand. I folded the letter back into the envelope and set it in a drawer. I couldn't throw it away, but I couldn't bear to read it again. Every memory from childhood seemed to rise with that letter, the nights when Sabrina's laughter echoed through the house while I sat in silence the mornings when my achievements went unnoticed. The way "Don't Be So Sensitive" became the anthem of our home. Those years had shaped me into someone who apologized for taking up space, who tried to earn peace by shrinking smaller. Sitting there in my quiet apartment, I realized I didn't owe anyone that version of myself anymore. A few days later, I decided to drive back to Cleveland, not to beg or explain, but to face it head on. The tension had built too long to keep it contained behind phone screens. I told Jacob what I planned, and he offered to come, but I shook my head. I need to do this myself. He nodded, though I saw the worry in his eyes. The drive was gray and endless, the highway stretching straight through fields that looked asleep in late winter light. By the time I pulled into my parents' driveway, the sun had dipped low, turning the sky the color of steel. Their house looked smaller than I remembered. I sat in the car for a moment, listening to the hum of the engine before cutting it off. Inside, the air smelled faintly of rosemary and detergent, the same as always. My father was at the dining table reading the newspaper while my mother stood at the counter arranging dinner. Sabrina was there too, leaning against the doorway, her arms folded. "Well," she said, voice cool, look, "who decided to visit?" We sat down to eat, the silence sharp enough to cut. My father didn't waste time. "Do you really want to divide this family?" "Nora, a wedding is a reunion, not a wall." I met his eyes and said quietly, "It's my wedding, not another stage for old wounds." My mother sighed. "You're being cruel. She's your sister. She's hurt." I glanced at Sabrina. She didn't look hurt. She looked entertained. "All my life," I said, my voice steadier than I expected, "you've excused everything she's done as a joke. You've turned her cruelty into charm. I can't let that ruin another day of my life." My father's hand hit the table hard enough to rattle the silverware. "We gave you everything," he snapped. "We paid for your schooling, your car, your roof. And this is how you repay us." I felt my chest tighten, but I didn't flinch. "You fed me," I said softly, "but you never saw me." "That's not the same thing." My mother pressed her napkin to her face, tears spilling through her fingers. "How can you speak that way to your parents?" she cried. "You're breaking my heart." Sabrina smirked faintly from her chair, her expression almost triumphant. I stood slowly, placing my napkin on the table. If loving this family means losing myself, then maybe breaking away is the only thing that can save me. I walked out to the sound of my father's voice rising behind me, but I didn't turn back. The cool night air met me at the door like a wave, steadying and sharp. By the time I reached the car, my hands were shaking, though not from fear. For the first time in my life, I had said everything I'd spent years swallowing. The drive back felt lighter, the dark highway lined with tiny glimmers of light from passing towns. When I reached Pittsburgh, Jacob was waiting on the couch, the lamp still on. He didn't ask what happened. He just pulled me close until my shoulders stopped trembling. In the weeks that followed, the silence from my parents became final. No more calls, no more letters, only Tyler's occasional updates, short, careful texts letting me know they were still angry, that Sabrina had been defending herself to anyone who would listen. I thanked him for the messages, but each time I told him the same thing: don't argue with them. Live your life. Spring came slow that year, bringing the first hints of warmth and soft green back to the city. Our wedding day drew closer, and I poured my focus into the details that mattered: the lake, the vows, the people who would truly celebrate with us. My grandfather called one afternoon, his voice kind but firm. "You can't control what others choose, sweetheart, but you can decide how you carry it." I didn't realize how much I'd needed to hear that until the call ended. As May turned into June, the invitations went out. My parents' names weren't on the list. Sabrina's wasn't either. Tyler sent a single-line message the next morning: "I'll stand with you at the aisle if you'll have me." I smiled when I read it. He didn't need to ask. He'd been standing beside me all along. By then I had stopped waiting for an apology that would never come. I had learned that silence can be an answer too. Still late at night, I sometimes found myself wondering if my parents felt even a flicker of doubt if they missed the daughter who had spent half her life trying to earn their love. But those thoughts faded each morning when I woke up to the sound of Jacob grinding coffee beans in the kitchen sunlight spilling across the counter. The life we were building was small but steady, full of ordinary kindnesses that didn't ask for anything in return. The week before the ceremony, I stood by the lake during the final walk through, the breeze cool against my face, the scent of lilacs drifting through the air. The water shimmered gold in the afternoon light, calm and endless. For a long while I just watched it, thinking of the girl I used to be, the one who stood in the corner of family photos, always out of focus. That girl had waited for permission to belong. This woman did not. Still, part of me knew the story wasn't over yet. Sabrina never stayed quiet for long, and the silence from my parents carried the kind of weight that comes before a storm. And deep down, I could feel it coming. The week before the wedding moved in quiet, measured steps. Every box on my list had been checked twice, the seating chart finalized, the flowers arranged, the sound system tested. Jacob and I wanted a simple ceremony, nothing extravagant, just the sound of waves at our backs and people we loved around us. Yet beneath the calm rhythm of planning, I felt a low hum of unease, the kind that never leaves when history has taught you not to trust the silence. On the morning of the rehearsal dinner, the sky over Lake Erie was pale and clear. The breeze coming off the water carried the smell of salt and grass, soft enough to make you forget what you were worried about. My grandfather arrived first, walking slowly, but with purpose. He held my arm when he stepped onto the dock, smiling through the wind. "You've built something beautiful here, Nora," he said. "Don't let anyone take it from you." His voice had the kind of steadiness only years can give. Tyler showed up soon after, sleeves rolled and hair windblown from the drive. He handed me a cup of coffee before saying a word. "They're still mad," he said finally. "Mom's been calling Aunt Ruth, trying to talk her into convincing you." I nodded, not surprised. "Did she say they're coming?" He shook his head. "Dad told her not to. Said if you can exclude one daughter, you can exclude the rest of us." Tyler gave a small, dry laugh. "Guess that includes me now." I reached out and touched his hand. "You know you're not like them." He looked out at the lake, his reflection caught in the water. "Yeah, but I'm still part of them," he said quietly. "Sometimes that's the hardest part." That night, Jacob and I sat on the porch of the cottage we'd rented for the week. The fairy lights strung along the railing swayed in the wind, and the sound of crickets filled the air. He placed his hand over mine thumb, tracing the edge of my ring. "If they show up, we'll handle it," he said softly. "If they don't, we'll still have everything we need." I nodded, but the thought lingered. What if Sabrina came anyway? The morning of the wedding dawned cool and gold. The lake shimmered under a wide stretch of sky, the air carrying the faint scent of lilacs from the gardens nearby. I dressed in a room that smelled of pressed linen and fresh flowers. My grandfather came to check on me just before the ceremony, dressed in his best navy suit, his hands trembling only slightly as he straightened his tie. "You ready?" he asked, eyes warm behind his glasses. "More than I ever thought I'd be," I said. He smiled, his voice low and sure. "Then let's walk." Outside, the chairs were filled with friends, distant relatives, and the few family members who had chosen love over loyalty. Jacob stood under the floral arch, the breeze moving through his hair. For a moment the world felt still, the air suspended in that perfect hush before a promise. My grandfather took my arm, steady as ever. "You're not walking alone, Nora," he whispered. The music began soft and slow, and we stepped forward together. When I saw Jacob waiting, his eyes fixed on mine, the weight of every year behind me seemed to lift. The seats where my parents should have been were empty, but the emptiness didn't feel hollow. It felt like space I'd finally reclaimed. I caught Tyler's gaze near the front row. He smiled, his expression proud and certain. The ceremony began, words falling gently between the wind and the water. And then, just as the officiant spoke about love and endurance, the sound of an engine broke through the quiet. Every head turned toward the gravel drive. A red sedan came to a stop near the gate, dust rising behind it. I didn't have to see the face to know. Sabrina stepped out first, sunglasses on, red lipstick bright against the pale morning light. Two of her friends followed, laughing in a way that didn't belong at a wedding. She took a slow look around the corners of her mouth, lifting as if the whole event were hers to command. My stomach tightened. Before I could move, Tyler was already walking toward her, his shoulders squared. Two of Jacob's friends joined him. One of them, Officer Luke Harper, still in his dress clothes, but unmistakably in control. "This is a private ceremony," Luke said evenly. "You're not on the guest list." Sabrina laughed, tossing her hair. "Don't be ridiculous. She's my sister. I can go wherever I want." Luke's tone didn't waver. "Ma'am, I'm asking you to respect the bride's wishes." Her friends looked uncomfortable now, shifting in their heels, but Sabrina stood her ground. "You can't stop family from showing up," she said sharply. Tyler took one step closer. "Actually, we can." His voice was calm, but his eyes were hard. For a long, tense moment, no one spoke. The breeze carried only the sound of the water against the rocks. Then Sabrina gave a small, bitter laugh. "Fine," she said, turning sharply toward the car. "Enjoy your little fairy tale." Her heels struck the ground like punctuation marks as she climbed back in. A moment later, the engine roared, and the car sped off, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. I stood there, the whole scene feeling half unreal, until Jacob squeezed my hand. "It's over," he whispered. "She can't touch this." Tyler returned to his seat, nodding at me once before sitting down. The officiant cleared his throat softly and began again. The rest of the ceremony unfolded like a deep breath after a storm. Jacob's vows were steady, his voice trembling only when he said, "You are my peace." When I spoke mine, I felt every word sink into the air around us like stones into still water. When we exchanged rings, the world seemed to narrow down to the space between us. Applause rose as we kissed, a sound that carried across the lake and scattered into the wind. My grandfather wiped his eyes. Tyler clapped until his palms were red. For the first time in my life, the joy in the room was mine, unshared, unchallenged. As evening fell, the reception lights flickered across the lake's surface. Music drifted through the air, mingled with laughter and the scent of roasted food. I watched my grandfather dance slowly with one of my cousins, both laughing like children. Tyler stood nearby talking with Jacob, their heads bent in easy conversation. I looked around and saw nothing missing. Later, as the sky turned to deep blue, Jacob and I stepped away from the crowd to stand by the water. The moon's reflection shimmered against the waves, and the sound of soft music carried from the tent behind us. He slipped his arm around my waist. "You did it," he said quietly. I leaned against him. "We did." He looked down at me, his expression gentle. "See, this is what family really looks like." I nodded, the words sinking deep. For the first time in years, I understood what he meant. Not the family you're born into, but the one that stands beside you when it matters. Behind us, laughter echoed again, warm and unforced. My grandfather sat beneath the tent lights, Tyler refilling his glass. The wind brushed past, carrying the faint scent of flowers from the archway. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the sound of the water and the laughter mix together. When I opened them again, the world felt lighter. My parents hadn't come. My sister had tried and failed to steal the day. And yet, standing there by the lake with the people who had chosen to love me, I realized something had shifted for good. But the calm that settled over us that night was only temporary. I didn't know it then, but the next message I would receive wouldn't be congratulations. It would be the start of the storm my family had been holding back for years. 2 days after the wedding, I woke to the soft rhythm of rain against the windows. The house was quiet except for the sound of Jacob making coffee in the kitchen. I thought the storm outside felt fitting peaceful, but full of echoes. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a message from my mother. The first line read, "You have shamed this family." I sat up slowly, staring at the words. Then another message followed, and another. Each one longer than the last, filled with accusations, that I'd humiliated them by excluding Sabrina, that the neighbors were gossiping, that I owed my parents an apology for the pain I'd caused. The last message ended with, "You've turned your back on the people who raised you." I didn't reply. For a while I just sat there listening to the rain and the hum of the coffee machine in the next room. When Jacob came in with 2 mugs, he saw my face and asked quietly, "They started again." I handed him the phone. He read in silence, then set it down and said, "You don't have to carry that anymore." By afternoon, Tyler called. His voice was steady but strained. "Mom's been calling nonstop," he said. "She called me a traitor for standing with you. Dad told me not to come home again." I closed my eyes, gripping the edge of the table. "Are you okay?" I asked. He let out a slow breath. "Yeah. It's strange, but I feel lighter, like I finally know where I stand." That night, I scrolled through old messages from my parents. Birthday wishes that sounded more like reminders. Short texts about holidays always ending with, "Don't forget to bring something for your sister." For years, I had tried to answer every one of them quickly, eager to keep peace. Now, for the first time, I let the phone rest dark on the counter. Silence was its own kind of answer. Days turned into weeks. I started my new work project, a long editing contract for a small publishing house downtown. My days filled with quiet hours at the desk, red-marking stories that didn't belong to me. Jacob would stop by with lunch or make dinner when I worked late. In the evenings, the 2 of us sat on the porch listening to the cicadas, learning what calm really felt like. Tyler visited on a Saturday a few weeks later. He looked different, tired but peaceful. Over dinner, he told us he'd decided to apply to schools out of state. "It's time I built something for myself," he said, "not for them." I could see how much it cost him to say it, but his eyes were clear. When he laughed that night, it sounded unburdened. Meanwhile, Sabrina's name began drifting into conversation again through relatives and family friends. My aunt called once, trying to soften the edges. "Your parents are worried about her," she said. "She can't seem to keep a job. Maybe if you talked to her, she'd settle down." I thanked her for calling, but I didn't promise anything. I'd spent too many years being the bridge they kept walking over. By late summer, word reached me that Sabrina had fallen into debt again, first with friends, then with a former employer. My parents were covering her rent, her bills, even her car payment. When I heard that, I wasn't angry. I just understood how deep their pattern ran, how much they needed her to stay helpless so they could keep calling it love. One morning in early September, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. When I answered, my father's voice came through, strained and unsteady. "Nora," he said, "we need your help." I sat very still, unsure if I'd heard him right. "My health hasn't been great," he continued. "I've had to take a leave from work. The bills are piling up. Sabrina's struggling. We're drowning here." I waited, listening to the faint hum of static between his words. "You've always been the responsible one," he said. "You've built a good life. You could help us get back on our feet." For a long moment, I couldn't speak. The old instinct to fix things, to smooth the tension, rose up like muscle memory. But the quiet part of me, the part that had learned to breathe again, kept me still. Finally, I said, "I'm sorry you're struggling. I hope you recover soon, but I can't keep carrying the weight for everyone else." There was a pause on the line. "You've changed," he said, his tone somewhere between surprise and disappointment. I thought of all the times I had begged for fairness and been told I was selfish. "Yes," I said softly. "I had to." After I hung up, I stood at the kitchen window for a long time, watching the trees sway in the wind. Jacob walked in and wrapped his arms around me. "You did what you needed to do," he said. And for the first time, I believed him. The following week brought a few more messages from my mother, shorter this time, almost pleading. "We're falling apart. You're the only one who can fix this." I didn't respond. Each time the phone buzzed, I let it ring until the screen dimmed. Eventually, the calls stopped. The house grew quiet again. Autumn came early that year. The air turned crisp, the mornings cooler. I planted roses by the fence, their pale petals standing out against the fading green. Life settled into a rhythm: coffee in the mornings, work in the afternoons, walks by the river in the evenings. It was simple, and it was enough. One evening, Tyler called from his new apartment in Chicago. He sounded happier than I'd heard him in years. "It's small, but it's mine," he said. "I start classes next week." I smiled, staring at the soft glow of the lamp beside me. "You made it out," I said quietly. He laughed. "Guess we both did." After we hung up, I sat for a while thinking about the word family. My father had always said it meant loyalty above all else. But loyalty without respect is just surrender, and I was done surrendering. Later that night, Jacob joined me by the window. He handed me a cup of tea and said, "You know, your quiet is different now. It's not fear anymore." I looked at him, the streetlight catching in his eyes, and nodded. "No," I said, "it's peace." Outside, the world was still the rain just beginning again. Each drop against the glass sounded steady and certain. I thought of my parents in their big house, still trying to hold together the story they'd built around Sabrina. And I thought of the smaller one Jacob and I had made here, honest, imperfect, real. I didn't know if they would ever see it the way I did, but maybe that was all right. Some truths don't need permission to exist. Still, as the wind picked up and the lights flickered, a part of me wondered what would happen the next time they called, because deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. Families like ours never let go quietly, and the storm that had only whispered so far was gathering again, waiting for its next chance to break. Winter came early that year, and with it a quiet that felt heavier than usual. Snow layered the sidewalks soft and even like a pause over the whole neighborhood. By then, months had passed since the wedding, and life had found a steady rhythm again. Jacob and I had fallen into the kind of routine I'd always dreamed of: morning coffee evenings by the fire, small plans that fit together like puzzle pieces. Then one gray morning in late December, I received a letter addressed in my mother's handwriting. The envelope was thick, sealed tightly as though holding something fragile. For a moment I considered tossing it aside, but curiosity won out. Inside was a single page written in her familiar looping script. "Your father has been ill," it began. "He's been resting, but things have been hard. Sabrina's trying her best to help, but we can't manage alone." I read it twice, then set it down on the counter. The words were careful, but the meaning beneath them was clear. She was asking me to come back, to fix things again. I stood there, the sound of the heater filling the room, my hands still on the letter. When Jacob came in, I handed it to him. He read silently and said, "It's up to you, but don't let guilt be the reason." That evening I called Tyler. He already knew. "Mom called me too," he said. "She said Dad's been in and out of the doctor's office, but it's mostly stress. She's hoping you'll cave." I asked what he planned to do. I told her I'd visit after the holidays, he replied, "but not to expect money. I can't go back to that." For a week I carried the letter folded in my coat pocket, unsure what to do. Each time I reached for my keys, I felt the edge of it against my hand. I thought of my father sitting in that house, still certain that control was love, that silence was respect. I thought of Sabrina still in her same cycle, untouched by consequence. A few days before Christmas, I finally made the drive to Cleveland. The roads were quiet, the fields glazed in frost, the air sharp through the car vents. As I turned down the old street, the sight of their house struck me. It looked smaller now, its windows dim, the porch light flickering like it couldn't decide whether to stay on. When my mother opened the door, her face broke into something between relief and surprise. "You came," she said softly. The living room smelled faintly of cinnamon, the same candle she always lit in December. My father sat in his armchair, wrapped in a blanket, the newspaper folded on his lap. He looked thinner, older somehow. "Nora," he said, his voice weaker than I remembered. "You look well." I nodded, unsure what else to say. My mother hurried to bring tea, her hands shaking slightly. Sabrina wasn't there, which felt both strange and familiar. My mother explained she was staying at a friend's for a few days, taking a break from stress. We sat mostly in silence, the sound of the clock ticking in the corner. My father cleared his throat finally. "Your mother worries too much," he said. "It's just exhaustion. The business is fine. Things have been tight." I recognized the tone the half-truth meant to sound stable. Then he looked up at me. "I hear you've done well for yourself. Maybe you could help us get through the winter just until things balance out." There it was, the old expectation dressed this time in politeness. My mother watched me closely, as if waiting for the daughter she used to know to nod and agree. But that daughter was gone. I set my cup down carefully and said, "Dad, I hope you recover soon. But I can't fix this anymore. Not with money, not with silence." My mother blinked, confused. "You've always helped when we needed you." I met her eyes. "And where did that ever leave me?" The room went still. My father's jaw tightened, his pride flickering through the weakness in his expression. "You've changed," he said again, just as he had on the phone months before. "We barely recognize you." I stood and adjusted my coat. "I know," I said quietly. "That's the point." My mother followed me to the door, pleading softly. "Nora, don't go yet. It's Christmas. Can't we just have dinner together?" I turned back to her, the hallway behind her dim and familiar. "You can call me when you're ready to talk about more than guilt," I said. Then I stepped outside. The cold air hit hard, but it felt clean. I walked to my car without looking back. The drive home was long and silent. Snow began to fall again, swirling in the headlights. By the time I reached Pittsburgh, it was nearly midnight. Jacob was still awake, waiting by the window. When I came inside, he didn't ask what had happened. He just took my coat and said, "You did what you needed to do." I nodded, feeling the warmth seep back into my hands. A few weeks later, Tyler visited. We sat by the fire, both of us quiet for a while before he said, "They called me after you left. Mom said you walked out without saying goodbye." He paused, staring into the flames. "But I told her I was proud of you." He told me he'd heard Sabrina had lost another job. The salon, then a small office position, each lasting less than a month. My parents were still covering her rent, still telling everyone she was between opportunities. Tyler shook his head slowly. "It's like watching the same movie on repeat," he said. I looked at my brother, grateful for the person he had become, the one who saw things clearly, who no longer let guilt shape his life. We talked for hours that night about everything but our parents. When he left the next morning, the house felt lighter, as if something had finally settled in place. In February, my grandfather called. His voice carried that calm steadiness I'd always leaned on. "Your mother told me you went to see them," he said. "I wanted to tell you, I'm proud of you. You did what was right, even if they don't understand it yet." I thanked him quietly, holding the phone to my chest after we hung up, the sound of his words still echoing. Life continued steady and peaceful. Jacob and I spent weekends planting herbs in the kitchen windowsill, small green shoots that caught the morning light. I took on new projects at work, and for the first time, I felt myself growing into something solid, someone who didn't need approval to exist. But in March, an envelope arrived in the mail, one with my father's handwriting again. This time it wasn't a plea, it was a notice. They were selling the family house. The letter said the upkeep had become too much, and they were moving south near relatives. At the end, there was one line, "Take care of yourself, Nora. We'll manage." I read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer. There was no anger, no satisfaction, just a quiet sense of ending. The house that had held so many arguments, so many apologies that never came, would soon belong to someone else. That night, Jacob and I took a walk through the neighborhood. The air smelled of thawing earth, and small patches of grass were pushing through the last of the snow. I looked up at the faint stars, the world feeling wide and still. For the first time, I realized the story wasn't about proving myself to them anymore. It was about finally being free of the need to. But even freedom carries echoes, and I knew one more would come before the past settled for good. Something would force us to close the final door, to make peace, not through their change, but through our own. Spring came early that year, soft and steady, the kind that fills the air with the scent of rain and blooming lilacs. Life had settled into a quiet rhythm. I spent my mornings editing manuscripts by the kitchen window, and my evenings walking with Jacob down the riverside path. Some days it still felt strange not to expect the phone to ring with another demand or accusation. But silence, I was learning, could be its own kind of mercy. One afternoon, I received a call from my grandfather. His voice carried the same calm strength it always had, but there was a tremor beneath it. "Your mother stopped by," he said. "She wanted me to tell you they've moved to Georgia. Your father's health is improving." I listened, waiting for the part where he'd ask me to reach out. Instead, he said, "She didn't ask for anything, just wanted you to know." After we hung up, I sat on the porch for a long while, watching the sunlight flicker through the trees. I thought about how strange it was that after years of chasing their approval, it ended not in apology or reunion, but in quiet distance. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped needing them to understand. A few months later, I found an envelope in the mail addressed in my mother's handwriting. Inside was a photograph my parents standing outside a small brick house smiling for the camera. On the back, in her looping script, she'd written, "We're doing better. I hope you are too." It wasn't an apology, not even close, but it was something softer than the silence we'd shared for years. I placed the photo in a drawer, not out of resentment, but because I wasn't ready to frame it. Some wounds don't need display to prove they've healed. Tyler called that evening from Chicago. He'd started his graduate program and was juggling classes and part-time work, but I could hear the lightness in his voice. "I drove past the lake today," he said. "It reminded me of your wedding. I still can't believe how calm you were with all that chaos." I laughed. Maybe calm was the only thing I had left to choose. He paused, then said, "You know you taught me that, to stop fighting for people who won't meet you halfway." That night after we hung up, I walked out to the garden behind our house. The roses I'd planted last fall had survived the winter and were starting to bloom again, soft, pink, fragile-looking, but strong beneath the surface. I thought about my parents, about Sabrina, about how long I had carried the idea that love meant endurance. But real love, I'd learned, doesn't demand that you disappear to keep the peace. A few weeks later, my grandfather's health began to fade. When the call came from the nursing home, I drove to Cleveland with Jacob and Tyler. The air smelled like rain when we arrived. My grandfather was resting his hands folded neatly on the blanket. He opened his eyes when he heard my voice. "You kept your promise," he whispered. "You built a life that fits you." I took his hand, feeling how light it had become. "You taught me how I said." He passed a few days later quietly the way he'd lived. At the service, the family gathered under the same church roof that had held so many of our milestones. My parents came sitting near the back. When the ceremony ended, my mother approached. Her hair was streaked with silver. Now her face tired but softer. She reached for my hand, and for the first time in years, I didn't pull away. "I'm glad you came," she said. "He always spoke so highly of you." Her voice trembled on the last word. I nodded, unable to say much, and she looked as if she understood that silence could be forgiveness too. My father stood beside her, thinner, quieter. He gave a small nod, no speeches, no apologies, just that single gesture. It was enough. After the service, Tyler and I stood outside by the old oak tree. The wind carried the scent of wet grass and lilies from the flower stands. "He'd like this," Tyler said. I smiled. He would. We stayed there for a long time, just listening to the wind move through the branches, the world spinning quietly around us. When we drove home that evening, the sun was low, streaking gold across the horizon. Jacob reached over, his hand resting on mine. "You did right by him," he said, "and by yourself." I looked out at the open sky, the road stretching endlessly ahead. "It took a long time," I said softly, "but I finally understand what peace really means. Now when I think back, I don't see the arguments or the distance first. I see the strength it took to step away, to rebuild, to let time soften what anger couldn't." Justice, I've learned, isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just the quiet life you build after chaos, the one that no one can take from you. I still keep the photograph my mother sent tucked safely in that same drawer. Not as proof of reconciliation, but as a reminder that some stories don't end with grand apologies. Sometimes they end with quiet acceptance and the grace to keep walking forward. And when people ask about my family, I tell them this: we're learning to love each other from a distance. Some bonds need space to breathe again, and that's all right. Love can still exist, even if it changes shape. If you've ever had to choose peace over approval, I hope this story reminds you you're not alone. Healing doesn't always look like reunion. Sometimes it's simply the moment you realize you've already come home. Take a moment to breathe, to think about the peace you've built, or the one you're still reaching for. And if this story found you at the right time, I hope you'll share it. Someone else might need it too.